Welcome to episode 26 of The Lowdown Show. I'm Neil Graham. This week I speak to someone I've wanted to talk to for a long time. It's Paul d'Orleans, who's a motorcycle historian, curator, author, and the editor of a website called The Vintagent, a must-read for people like me who love and occasionally hate old motorcycles. Paul's a smarty pants, but he's not a snob, and I apologize in advance for our off-topic ramblings. But before we dive in, a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, and naturally, exclusions apply. Shall we take the plunge? Paul, you have carved out, I think, the most peculiar sort of space in motorcycling. You are sort of this bon vivant. You are an expert on vintage bikes, on the culture of bikes, custom and non-custom. What led you to this point? How did you get here? How were you introduced to bike? I mean, it's a long story, but start off at the beginning.
Yeah, people ask me, it's like, well, how can I do what you do? I'm like, well, maybe you could live my life. It's too late. It really, I mean, it's lifestyle. I started riding when I was 15. I published the story many times about how I grew up in Stockton, California, and found out I could graduate high school a year early, and I hated high school by taking night classes. And the only way I would dare go to take night classes at the local junior college was with my own transportation. I didn't have a car, I didn't have a driver's license, but I could buy a moped. So I bought a Honda Express. My mother actually loaned me the money, and went to night classes, took those 2 courses and graduated, and never had any accidents, never had any problems, and rode a little bit in college after that. I went to UC Santa Cruz, and it was after university. I had put an old printing press in my mother's basement in San Francisco, and I was deep in the kind of punk rock, kind of anarchist, kind of political scene in San Francisco at the time. And we were making posters and books and things like that for shows. And the guy who actually knew how to run the printing press, his name is Jim Gilman, wrote an old BMW /2, an R50/2 he dragged out from under a staircase, and completely, original finish. He wasn't going to do anything to that bike, but it ran great. And he let me ride it around, and I just fell in love. But Jim had bought every issue from issue 1 of Classic Bike and Classic Motorcycle, which only started publishing in the 80s, right? I think the first Classic Bike was quarterly, and from like 1978, and Classic Motorcycle started the same way in the early 80s. So it wasn't that much. In like 1984, we're talking about, it was like 2 milk crates of magazines, but it was every issue. And I have every issue. So that started the ball rolling. It was like somebody handing a 14-year-old 2 crates of porn, I just poured over those magazines and literally just wore them out. And it was the start of an education, and I became obsessed. And I was self-employed as a house painter, a decorative house painter, and a muralist. I was an art major, politics and environmental studies at university, so I could figure out how to do any kind of paint finish. And so that's how I made my money, and I made good money, and bikes were cheap, so I started buying bikes. Started out with like a BMW R60/2, and then went on to a Norton Atlas, and just went there. I've owned over 300 motorcycles. So,
300, my Lord.
And that's since 84. So we're talking 40 years now. So clearly I was very intensely buying and selling for many, many years, and would buy whole collections and, disperse them, keep them, ride them, and kept what I liked. My riding style in the 80s and 90s, and for most of the 2000s, was very cafe racer, very, hot street oriented, but vintage. And I ended up, owning a Norton Manx that I rode on the street, or an Velocet KTT that I rode on the street for tens of thousands of miles, Velocet Thruxtons, super hot Norton Atlas converted racers. And, I loved it. And I started getting to older and older bikes. And in the 80s and 90s, no internet. So to satisfy my intense curiosity, I rode around San Francisco. I had this R26 that I love, this BMW single, and I'd putt around San Francisco, and I had like a milk crate strapped on the back, and I would go to every used bookstore in town. It was like my circuit. If I had a day off from my work, I would go and hit every used bookstore in town looking for motorcycle books. And I'd always come home with a stack. And what you're seeing behind me is like about a third of my collection. You can't even see it all. It's like a lot. There's 1,500 books right here. So I probably have about 4,500 books.
Wow.
Thousands of magazines going back to I started collecting Scientific Americans from the 1860s, because that's when the first motorcycle started to appear in the United States, steam motorcycles in 1867. So all part of my research, all write-offable on my taxes. But it's a good way to at least make your passion obsession hurt a little less.
What is it about old bikes for you? I mean, it seems to be that you have interest in the most pedestrian motorcycles. You have interest in the rarest of the rare. I mean, what is it about? Is it this intersection of sort of science and the mechanics of them, or the politics of them? I mean, what if you had to articulate it? I mean, how would you say? Because it's not just I got a couple old bikes in the shed. It's much beyond that for you.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the root of it, do you think?
It's so rich. I think I talk to other historians who are specialize in things, and it doesn't matter what it is. Okay, so right now, for example, I'm listening to the History of Rock Music in 500 Songs podcast. Incredible podcast, perhaps the most important podcast ever done. Amazing.
I heard Rick Rubin was recommending it. So.
Incredible. And if he finishes, because he's 4 years into what's likely to be a 12-year project, it will be the largest single work of literature by a single human, at 2 million words. So my wheels are spinning on how this could be done with motorcycles. But here's the deal. It's like he talks about everything. And if you read my website, the Vintagent, the motorcycles are a MacGuffin, as they say in film industry. It's like, ostensibly, that's what we're talking about. But really, we're talking about everything. We're talking about the politics, we're talking about design, we're talking about art, we're talking about music, we're talking about literature and history. We're just talking about people, right? That's really what it's about. So if you're fascinated with any particular subject, if you just scratch the surface a little bit, I say motorcycles are like a hologram. It's like the world is contained in them. So if you just dig a little bit deeper, who's riding them, or even if you're just talking about the motorcycle per se, what was happening, what country was it done, who were the designers, what was the manufacturer's history, what were the industrial politics of the time, what were the material politics of the time, where were they sourcing these, who was designing what, and what was the state of that design in this period, what does the shape of it have to do with what came before or after? There's just so much to talk about, so I've never found a lack of subject. There is no lack of subject matter. It's infinite.
There's
and
a
I'll
friend
never get to it all.
although you're giving it your damnedest. I'll give it, you are.
It'll be a lifelong project.
There's a friend of mine, an industrial designer. He says that once you go 5 or 6 levels deep, it always leads to the Nazis. Just about. no matter what sort of technology, and I laughed, and I thought he was just being a smartass, and then he gave me some really complicated, long-winded examples to back this up, so of which I didn't absorb enough to be able to retell it, but he wasn't wrong
in his case. I mean, if that's your bent. But I mean, of course, that's true in motorcycles to a degree, but certainly not ultimately, because motorcycles were depicted starting in about 1818.
Yes.
that long predates the concept of fascism and Hitler in particular. So, but he plays a part for sure. I mean, I just wrote a little piece about, I bought this bike. I was just in Buenos Aires, and back in the 90s, I bought 5 motorcycles out of Argentina, 4 Rough Superiors and 1 Zenith, which is a rival to Rough Superior. Actually, 1 more gold stars at Brooklands, the biggest speed bowl at the time, for 100+ mile-an-hour laps, and held lots of world land speed records. And the bike I bought was a supercharged Zenith that held the South American land speed record in 1931. And 1700 cc overhead valve JAP motor in a Zenith chassis, completely untouched since 1930. What a thing. So I was just in Buenos Aires. I met the man who actually had owned this bike. I bought all those bikes through brokers, so it was amazing to meet the actual individuals. It's a continuing story because now we have a relationship. But when I write about that bike and the speed record wars in the 1930s, it comes back to the Nazis, because the Germans were funding BMW and DKW to, just like with the Olympics and in other sports and in other endeavors, airplane racing, etc., and car racing. They were funding all levels of sport for national prestige, and that meant that other countries answered the call and response. Gifted amateurs like George Bruff and the folks at JAP Motors and Eric Fernahoe and all these other people who were not being paid and had tiny little factories that produced a grand total of 3,000 motorcycles in a 15-year stretch and things like that.
Yes.
We're up against, the might of millions of Deutschmarks and wind tunnels and trained engineers, and these guys were, for the most part, seat of the pants, suck it and see type of engineers. Although there were people like Harry Westlake, who were trying to scientificize the study of motorcycle engines, and Sir Harry Ricardo, another English genius, sort of trying to quantify what was happening inside of an engine. So anyway, to go back to your point, there's a case where it does go back to the Nazis, and but they were doing speed records before Hitler, in the teens and etc. So,
well, the thing that strikes me about you as a and I'm a reader of the Vintagent, your website, and what I find interesting about you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but most, and I include myself, most people who are into old stuff kind of go through phases. I went through a British bike phase, and I've seemed in an early American phase, and I seem to be stuck, to my chagrin, in an Italian phase, which is making me insane. But when we tend to get locked into a phase, we tend to be dismissive of the other phases.
Right.
Now, you don't seem to do that. You seem to, or anything to do with modernity, which is post 1970. I mean, a lot of people don't want to talk about that, or the new Aprilia, or what, but you don't seem to be hamstrung in that way.
Yeah, I'm excited about motorcycles in general. I mean, I just think they're miraculous, and I know why more people don't ride them, but I don't know why more people don't ride them, if you know what I mean. I just think that if you respond to moving through space on 2 wheels, so many people love bicycling. Well, why the hell wouldn't you want a motor to get that feeling infinitely? So yeah, I'm just passionate about motorcycles, and get it why someone would be all about, let's say, racing a Ducati 851, or a brand new, or taking a new KTM down the length of Baja. I get it. I prefer personally to ride something which I consider to have a little more character, although fans of new motorcycles say, well, the KTM has tons of character, or our Ducati 851, and they do. It's just I have a bent towards a little bit older motorcycles aesthetically, really, is what it is.
let's leave the generalities behind and get into a few specifics if we could. Now, you have, I think I first became aware of you as being sort of associated with the new custom movement.
Yeah.
And in fact, you published that book. And now here's my beef against customs. And I want you to have I'm customs torment me. And it's kind of my guilty pleasure is, and as a San Franciscan, you will understand this completely, is a panhead powered chopper,
Right.
with skinny tires from a
Right.
very specific era.
Right.
Because I grew up in a lunch bucket town on one of the Great Lakes, and there were Satan's Choice, and they all rode these bikes.
Right.
And they went fast, and they pissed my mother off, and they made a lot of noise. And to invoke the cliche, they ticked every box,
right.
for a teenage boy. But here's my argument. If you go to a luthier and have a custom guitar made, and a former partner of mine was a musician, and she played this $18,000 acoustic guitar at a shop in Nashville, and it was astounding. So for all that money, you get incredible craftsmanship, beautiful action on the fretboard, and this incredible sound. Now, with a custom motorcycle, you're almost always taking away function.
Well, okay. So you're talking about a very limited definition of custom motorcycle. Okay. So, and, I was, all right. So I started my blog in 2006. And it was just in response to having taken a lot of photographs and having done a lot of stuff. I'd done a lot of rallies in Australia and Europe, and I'd ridden all over the world. And I was asked to judge like important concours, like the Legend of the Motorcycle concours that happened in 2006, 7, 8 here in Half Moon Bay. And because I got a reputation as someone who knew what he was talking about, after all, reading all these books. And I won't say I was a purist, but because I was so deep into what great designers had created throughout history, that I was a little bit against customs. But I was also a really big cafe racer guy in my riding career. I loved riding bikes with clip-ons and rear sets and bump stop saddles and flange rims and special brakes. And it's like, at some point I realized, I'm riding custom motorcycles. Right. A cafe racer. If it didn't come from the factory, my Velocette Thruxton came from the factory, perfect. But the Norton that I rode that had been raced and then converted to the street was completely custom. It had Ceriani forks and nice shocks and Fontana brake and fiberglass Dunstall bodywork, et cetera, et cetera. It was a custom bike. And so I disagree that customs are always about, that you lose function with custom, but there's a million kinds of custom. On the other end of the spectrum, you have, I'm not even talking about the fat tire chopper craze of the 90s and 2000s. I'm thinking,
let's just not talk about that.
Let's just not talk about that.
In fact, as a historian, can you just erase that phase?
Can you redact that? No. Actually, I know some of the people who made their careers, like Billy Lane and et cetera, on those, and they're great people. And actually, a lot of those people are enthusiasts of vintage motorcycles and huge collectors. Yes. So, and as Billy Lane is, and many others. But I'm thinking more like people like Walt Siegel, who does remarkable limited edition, ultra lightweight, super groovy mostly Italian bikes, or Shinji Kimura, who does crazy, hauled him off the set of Godzilla, wabi-sabi, hand-hammered, incredible insect-like machines, or Ian Barry's Falcon motorcycles, which are just insanely exquisitely functional. It's like Phil Irving on acid for a couple of years. What would he do?
Right.
And that's, so those have various levels of extreme functionality. It's like they're become incredibly purpose-built, but they're also works of high design, or motorcycle as art. So
But is
And
a
then, and
but
then
is
there's
a
a lot of junk.
but is but is a motorcycle art? And sometimes when I think about this, and I had a conversation with a friend a while ago, and I think that we call motorcycles art. I don't think they are art, and I think it's because we have such. Unfortunately, I mean, I come from a blue collar background. My father was a tool and die maker and a machinist, and so I grew up around milling machines and lathes, and that was just what was out there. But I think as we and you see this because so few young people are interested in the trades,
Right.
is that I think we just don't respect the handcrafted. In I mean, yes, in certain circles, but I think generally, I mean, if you say to a teenager that I'm going to be a welder or a fabricator, they're like, oh, you know, not everywhere, of course, but I
Yeah.
just think that we use this term art. I mean, I would say Picasso's Guernica is art, but it can't get you to your girlfriend's house for dinner. So, I mean, don't
Well, it could if you sold it and bought a mega.
don't complicate it. Don't complicate it.
Okay.
But I just think that can't we just respect these as beautiful works of industrial design? Do we always have to fall back to this notion of the motorcycle as art?
Well, okay. Let's backpedal a little bit. Okay, so that in the whole of human history until about the mid late 1800s, it was all considered art. It was all considered craftsmanship. It was all considered the work of gifted, handwork, right? Because there was no industrial processes to make reproductions. Even the screws on an incredible handmade shotgun, you can see one up there.
I noticed that up there. Yeah.
That is a Anton Burkhardt shotgun from the 1850s, and it's exquisite. And every nut and bolt is hand done on his own lathe, and it's tooled, and it has animals carved on it, etc. I'm not really a gun guy, but I saw that. I was like, wow, that's incredible. That's art. But very few gun makers would say that's art. It's just a gun. So anyway, so in the mid late 1800s, the École des Beaux-Arts and the Academy in France decided, no, there are 5 art forms: architecture, poetry, drawing, painting, and music, right? And everything else is craft. That definition, that distinction never existed before. When you would go to early prototypical museums, which were places that literally housed inspiration from the muse, right? From the gods in all its expressions, they would have armor and armory and painting and tapestry and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they were all, it was a level playing field. Actually, there's a fantastic book, I'm forgetting the name right now, written by a French art collector in the 1950s about the value of things throughout history. And he goes back to the Egyptians and talks about how much X was worth, how much someone would pay for a carving of, Osiris in nephrite jade or something like that. And he would talk about it through up until the 50s. And it was shocking how many artists that people were absolutely crazy for in, let's say, 1900 that are completely forgotten today. I mean, art historians know who they are, but you and I don't. I mean, they're the Damien Hirsts of the 1900, who will be forgotten because what the hell they really produced of enduring value. So anyway, there was this separation between art and design, or art and craft, and that definition is dissolving again today. When my daughter Zoe was at university, she actually wrote her thesis on exactly this subject. And then she opened a gallery, which she called Hand Job in Brooklyn, which made it really hard to Google it.
Good for
but
her.
She knew. She's got a great sense of humor. And what she would do is she would commission fine artists, sculptors, and painters, etc., to make multiples of functional objects, whether it was pencils or cups or lamps or whatever. She would have a lamp show and get all these painters and sculptors to make lamps, and they were extraordinary. And her concept has since been copied widely, as you can imagine. Now there's lamp shows at major galleries in New York. but she really is the one who like doubled down on this concept. And it was all just to kind of batter away at this, like, silly distinction between the amount of effort and time someone might, who, let's say, a Shinya Kimura or an Ian Barry might spend, thousands and thousands of hours making some extraordinary motorcycle. Why is that different than some weird OCD painting that somebody makes? It's just a bunch of repetitive crap, that's called art, and if you go around to the galleries in New York, you see a lot of that, just like, okay, whatever. Whereas these people, a few of these individuals have really taken their passion for motorcycles to another level, So I'm not going to go to the mat and say, it's art. But, to me, that shows as much dedication, ingenuity, genius as, the best painters. So why not?
eBay Motors is here for the ride. This week's Fireside Chat is about old motorcycles. On the morning of our conversation, Paul bought an old Kawasaki Scrambler, a 650 four-stroke twin before Big K doubled down on two strokes, a $2,000 bike. Odd bikes like this are some of my favorites. I used to own a Bridgestone 175 two-stroke twin, and I've talked about it before, probably the best engineered anything I've ever owned. Right up until the point that the engine seized. And of course, parts were impossible to find, pre-internet era especially. And so my father and I, with the typical ingenuity, hacked the engine out and replaced it with the 350 Honda four-stroke single from an XL 350 trail bike. And in the process, managed to destroy two pretty good motorcycles. Of course, the Bridgestone was dead, but the XL 350 was a really wonderful bike. And we thought combining the two would work. It didn't, and it's hard to even articulate why it didn't work, but it just wasn't happy. It's like pounding back a pint of beer with breakfast. It just doesn't work. But if that does work for you, you really should talk to someone, really. And now a word from our sponsor. With over 122 million parts, you can make sure your number one ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. Now back to my conversation with Paul Dorleans. You're listening to The Lowdown, presented by advrider.com and sponsored by ebaymotors.com. Let's talk about the bike riders. In fact, over my shoulder, and I'm going to do the same thing that you did. I have one of the, Aperture has the square print sale.
I love it.
Every now and then. I've got one of the Danny Lyon's photographs of the one with at the Scrambles track.
I love it. I have the same one.
Oh, perfect.
Same thing. Isn't it Magnum that does it? I think Magnum is.
Is it Magnum? Sorry.
Yeah, Magnum. He's been a member of the Magnum Photo Collective for decades.
You're right. Magnum, not Aperture. So the bike riders came out. Now, I for me, the bike riders was one of the first. I think reading the stories of Raymond Carver and the photographs of Danny Lyon were the first two sort of artistic things to a kid that really spoke to me, because the one photographs and stories from the Chicago Outlaws in the 60s, in the mid 60s, right. The Danny Lyon book.
Yep.
And there's recently been this movie about it. And of course, when you have something that you care about and that means something and feels kind of personal, like the Danny Lyon book did to me, and you hear there's going to be a movie with movie stars in it, right. You have some trepidation. I think the movie's pretty good. Yeah. And I'm curious to what your response is to it.
Well, I would credit a lot to their production designer was spot on. That was huge, right? So no big obvious bloopers on their clothes, what they were riding, what was driving around on the street, the music, the signage, all that. It's like they nailed it. Somebody did their homework. And Danny Lyons, and they did an amazing job of vivifying his photographs, his still photographs. It's like they made the bar, that they shot. They made the Scrambles track. They made the apartment that really evoked the era and his photos, So in that sense, the story, they had to make a script. The book is not a novel, it's a series of interviews. There is no story there per se. So they had to make a story, and they made up a bunch of stuff, and especially the the kind of the ending, the post Dandelion era, where they moved to Florida and blah blah blah, or even when Johnny is killed, all that's not in the book. So all that stuff is a script. So, and it's a pretty good script. It's not the best script I've ever seen, but it worked as a movie. So I thought, for what the book was, to make it a film, I think it was as good as we could get.
It's maybe you could speak, Paul, a little bit to that, because and maybe I've got this wrong, but maybe you could edify me a little bit. But it seems that when Dandelion started writing with the Bike Riders, it seems like there was this transition between sort of riding as a social club and riding as a 1% club, as we tend to think of outlaw clubs now.
Yeah, that's what the film is.
Like, it's about that transition, isn't it?
Is that transition. But we were talking about this earlier. Dandelion's own history is fascinating. So, I got my first copy of the book, The Bike Riders, for my birthday in 1985, and I was I was in a motorcycle gang called the Maries, because it was all women who had the middle name of Marie, and me, who knew how to work on the bikes. And in fact, I think I have the claim of being the only straight white male to ride, or maybe the first straight white male to ride in the Dykes on Bikes parade in San Francisco, because I was escorting a friend, and the person who had the bullhorn, who was giving us instructions on where to go, I was going to turn around and leave, and she said, "No, you need to get in the line." So I had to jump. Okay, on my little R26. Long story. So one of our friends, Marilyn Bull, gave me this. She found it for 50 cents, a copy of the Bike Riders, and she inscribed it in purple crayon, "To Paul from Crazy Tits." And it's like, I treasure that book. And it was the first of many copies that I found over the years. But so it's a very important book to me. Like, to me, that was an incredible eye opener of, before I read Hell's Angels by Hunter S. Thompson, this kind of new journalism around, and photojournalism around motorcycle culture. But Dandelion started out as a staff photographer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, registering Black people to vote in Alabama and Arkansas and stuff. He was friends with Cliff Boz, who eventually went on to design the Easy Rider choppers, and that's a whole other story we can talk about. But so his career started with this nonviolent thing, and then he went to art school in Chicago and became a member of the Outlaws as a project, which is the polar opposite. An all white, well, mostly white bike club that was violent, so what an interesting cat. And then he went on to have a career. He carried on his theme of kind of political engagement. Most of his books are, his next book was The Destruction of Lower Manhattan, about how all these wonderful buildings were getting torn down for skyscrapers. So Dandelion's a really interesting cat. And, the context for that book, and his discipline in only including the words of the actual subject. I mean, it's incredible. I think it's an incredible work, and his photography is just genius and timeless. So to make a film of it, I thought was, my first impression was, and then I knew that he was alive, so they couldn't make it without his participation. So I thought, okay, if he's signing off on it, it must be okay. So that's how I came to see the film.
Yeah, because he has, I told you a story off the air that when I was in art school, he came and spoke to us and the students. And I think a bunch of white young people just irked him generally. And he was quite grumpy, but he is like a Robert Frank level of grumpiness, doesn't he?
Yes.
Legendary. Notoriously so. Now let's nerd out a little bit. I sort of agree very much with your analysis of it. I don't think it was a spectacular film, but I think it was good.
Right.
And
It's
I
not
think that
on the waterfront. It's not. It could have been, maybe with different filmmakers and a different screenwriter, could have been a work of outstanding genius, but hey, how rare is that?
they,
It was
they
a
need
Hollywood movie, about as good as they make them these days.
they needed our pal Kenneth Anger to make the Bike Riders. I think
Oh
that
my
would have been
God. Well,
that would have been challenging.
he did his own version. Uh, uh, you know, I, you can actually see Scorpio Rising on the Vintagent. We have it on there. Kenneth Anger's amazing film. So, I mean, that's another story we have to backtrack a little. When Kenneth Anger went to film school, like immediately after the war, and then he went to Paris and he met Jean Cocteau, and he became Jean Cocteau's lover around the time he made, after he had already made Orpheus, or maybe he was making Orpheus. Anyway, so he like absorbed what he could from the master, the man who had invented the trope of what I call the dark rider, which is the motorcycle as menacing figure. That figure did not exist before Jean Cocteau. Any depiction of motorcyclists before World War II, it was transportation. It was exciting. You look at Man with a Movie Camera or Impatience or other movies done in the 20s and 30s that included motorcycles. There was no menace at all. It was just an exciting machine with erotic implications, actually. And Cocteau took it, and in my opinion, he had witnessed in Paris, the Nazis riding in on their BMWs and Zundaps in front of the armored columns, and something twigged in him, and he used that image. So Death's henchmen in Orpheus ride a couple of Indians, actually, a mismatched pair. I think it's like a 1940 Sports Scout and a 40 Chief, that he, who knows if they were there before the war or whatever. But
Right.
So Kenneth Anger went and lived, was his lover, studied with him, and then came back to the States and did Scorpio Rising, which is a far more honest.
What year was Scorpio Rising? Do you know?
I think is it 53?
That early?
It's after the Wild One. Maybe it's even later than that. Maybe it's 58. I can't remember. Sorry.
Okay.
It's 50s. I'm pretty sure. But Scorpio is the name of a character who rides a motorcycle and lives in a shabby little warehouse garage thing. And you see him, pour out a salt shaker full of amphetamines or cocaine, probably amphetamines, which were legal then, to get revved up for a night of utter debauchery, and they'll break into a church and he delivers some blasphemous sermon, and it's all very jump cut and weird and experimental and fabulous. I mean, it's dark and amazing. And Kenneth Anger followed that up with Custom Car Commandos, which I believe is also on the Vintagent, which is a man with a feather duster going over his hot rod, cleaning his hot rod in detail. And it's it shows the hot rod as like a sexual object, like a fetish. And, it's one of the first films to use like pure contemporary pop music as the soundtrack. It's almost a music video.
Right.
And his work really influenced a lot of filmmakers, especially Catherine Bigelow, who did The Loveless, which is Robert Gordon's soundtrack over the same kind of eroticized motorcycles, sexy. Maybe some of them are gay because they were imprisoned together bikers. There's a lot of implications around that. And anyway, so I just love that thread, the whole thing.
You're listening to The Lowdown, presented by advwriter.com and sponsored by ebaymotors.com. I've had this theory, and I'd like to know if you think it holds water. And I think that I tend to equate sort of 50s and 60s chopper culture with certain kinds of American music, like jazz or like bluegrass, in that there's a real, and both in the culture and the construction of the bikes, there's a real language. Like I love bluegrass, but there are rules,
right?
And I know that art is supposed to break rules, but these certain forms of traditional music, there's a purity to them almost, and I think there's almost a purity to the chopper, and I think that the chopper is America's great contribution to motorcycling.
Well, I mean, I wrote the book, The Chopper, The Real Story. Unfortunately, it's going to cost you about $900 on eBay these days. But
You were saying you can't, it's no longer in print.
no.
Ah.
So I may take up the reins and reprint it with another publisher. But, you know, I say explicitly in the book, it's like the chopper is as an American invention as jazz and rock and roll. You know, it's like there are so many purely American expressions that the rest of the world came to copy, but down at their roots, yeah, the chopper has its roots in the 20s with cut downs, or California cut downs as they were called, which were typically Harley Davidson JDs, some Indians, you know, that were lightened for performance basically. And chopping a frame goes back into the early 30s, where Mechanics Illustrated magazine showed how to chop the frame on a Harley JD to make it shorter and lower to make a cut down, and that's included in the book. And it becomes like a thread of customization that starts in the United States and wasn't taken up in the rest of the world until Easy Rider came out, you know, and that was the bomb that dispersed it everywhere. But before that, it was purely, before 1970, it was a purely American, and as the people who were involved in it at the time said, it was a no money thing. It's like there was no money. No one, you could not buy any of those parts off the shelf. You had to make it yourself, you know, or take a tank from, you know, a Mustang motorcycle or something else, you know.
Yeah,
that was off the shelf. But to make the motorcycle, it was yourself or the guy with a shop down the street. There was no Arlen Ness. There was no Uncle Bunt. There was no shop that would do it for you. So, and an Easy Rider changed that.
and there would be no Honda Shadow without the chopper, would there?
There would be no Yamaha 650 LTD, the original cruiser, or or the Harley Davidson Night Train, or the the original FX series. That was Willie G trying to get into the chopper thing by putting a Sportster front end on a big twin. You know, so yeah, the world had to answer to the incredible popularity in the 70s of choppers. And you know, it's interesting. There were politicians who were trying to ban choppers, trying to ban modified frames in the United States. And Yamaha actually came, and I'm friends with a guy named Mike Vills, Fast Mikey. And he, when he was a teenager, built this show Triumph, the Brute, which won everything. It was a beautiful, beautiful bike. And that got him a job with Ed Roth at his shop making customs. And then he eventually started working with Yamaha, and he had a panhead chopper. But he and Dick Allen, who is famous for his forks for choppers, worked out what you needed on an extended fork to make a bike handle. And they realized, oh, you need 6 inches or more of trail. Otherwise, it feels like you've got sandbags. And you can tell the bikes where someone has actually thought about frame geometry and not. I mean, I had a BSA chopper that was horrible, you know, it would wobble, and you needed all this pressure just to get going. And once you were going, it's fine, because the wheelbase was 9 feet, 10 feet. But Mike Vills had sorted out how to make a chopper handle. And actually, he was working at Yamaha in a huge distribution center in Southern California. And he was actually painting all those yellow and black race team bikes and helmets and everything. That was all his work in the early 70s. And so Yamaha sent some engineers from Japan to study his panhead, because he would go out on rides with, you know, his buddies riding XS 650s and RD 350s, and he'd smoke them because his bike weighed nothing and it, you know, had 70 horsepower and it handled. And so the engineers like studied the geometry on his bike and weighed it and did everything, and they refused to sign off. They actively pushed against the concept of banning choppers because they realized that it was this was just wasn't a move for safety or anything. It was just about people didn't like choppers,
Right.
and they realized that was bullshit, that these were motorcyclists and they were very popular and they could be made to handle. And not long after, they came out with their special editions, the limited models that were the first cruisers. And that's what choppers became in the commercial market, which was cruisers.
Right. Right. Let's get into vintage bikes. You're very involved in you're involved with auction houses as sort of a pundit. Now, the argument has always been made that about the value of older motorcycles, that when, and you know this trope as well as anyone, which is that, the enthusiast, the bikes we generally, as we get older, the bikes we wanted when we were 18 are the bikes we buy.
Right.
And so the what was going to happen is that, now that the boomers are aging out of life, there's a whole bunch of motorcycles that were coveted by them. The argument goes that these motorcycles won't be coveted by successive generations. Is there truth to that?
Absolutely, especially with mass-produced motorcycles. So there's a difference between, let's say, a Bruff Superior, which is likely one of 100 for whichever model you're interested in. Let's say it's a late matchless engine SS100. Well, they build 102 of them, so it's always going to have rarity value, and because of its history and its story and the history of motorcycling, they will never be cheap. They never were cheap. Even when bikes cost $3,000, well, those were the $3,000 bike, or those were the $5,000 bike,
Right.
So, and let's say, but to contrast that, something like a Vincent, which they made something like 15,000 after the war, is not especially rare. So Black Shadow prices are like a canary in the coal mine. They go up. 5 years ago, it was impossible to find a good Black Shadow for less than $150,000, $180,000. Well, hello, now you can buy them for $70,000. So what's happened? Well, it's the third wave of, waves crashing that I've known of since the 80s, of Shadows being worth $100,000, then $20,000, and now, then it was $150,000. You know what I mean? So. And at the moment, what you're seeing is things that were mass production, let's say a Sportster or a Panhead, that had their moment, or even an Indian Chief, and now they're getting cheap. Or a British bike, like a 1960s Triumph or Norton. They started to hit like $25,000, $27,000. Well, hello, now they're 12 or less for a really good one. And so in that sense, it's true. The wave is shifting. Now, if you want a pristine Honda RC30 or Kawasaki 750 triple two-stroke, you're going to pay a lot of money. You're going to be paying 30 grand plus. That's not $200,000, as a 1936 knucklehead is going to cost you. So yeah, I think it's a combination. Mass production bikes, they'll have their moment, and then the moment will fade. Rare bikes, Grand Prix winners, exclusive models, usually the fastest motorcycle produced in any era always retains a high value, like an RC30 or a Ducati 851 or 900, early 900 Super Sport. They're going to keep a certain value because they will always be coveted because they had an objective value, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Karl Marx said, once the utility value is over, there is no value, right? So an obsolete motorcycle has no value because it has no further utility. Everything has an intrinsic value when it's useful, and then when it's obsolete, it's just the whims of the moment. So old motorcycles have no inherent value except as scrap. so invest at your own risk. I mean, I had a friend who was an investment banker, just briefly, in the 2000s when things were, or in the late 90s when things were going crazy in the stock market, and he had a bunch of Bruff Superiors. I said, "Do you think it's a good idea to invest in these? I mean, should I be buying more?" And he says, "No." He says, "Motorcycles are a terrible investment."
Right.
And I've taken that to heart.
Well, it's I mean, one thing I've the sort of the phenomenon, which is bring a trailer, the auction site. One of the things I find most interesting on that is that in terms of motorcycles, is you'll see things that were historically worth money, Harleys, will sell for $4,200.
Yeah.
And there'd be a Z50 Christmas edition.
Yeah.
And it's $12,000.
Yeah.
Or an ST90. So it's,
I've seen them go for $50,000 at Mecum auctions in Las Vegas. I mean, insane.
and all of a sudden Hondas, which were, dime a dozen, and now all of a sudden those bikes that I wouldn't even have thought of them as collectible because they were too common. But it seems like there was enough enthusiasts of a certain age that wanted those bikes that their parents wouldn't allow them in the 70s to get them.
Yeah, but that was 45 and 50 years ago. So
exactly, and
we're getting a little bit of a lag, but for a bike which they produce hundreds of thousands of, don't expect a steep increase in value. In fact, I would say things are going down unless it's an incredible, first year sandcast Honda CB750, of which they made about 3,400 of, that has a kind of value. But a 72 Honda CB754, why is that worth more than $3,000? Well, maybe it's $6,000, but that's what you're going to see. And in my opinion, $6,000 is the new sort of like gimme price.
Right.
I mean, I just bought a bike for a complete and running 1970 Kawasaki 650, a W2 TT, which is a very rare, like a 2 or 3 year model, like a scrambler 650 Kawasaki before they went into their 2-stroke phase. $2,000. It's like bikes are cheap again.
Another, I mentioned the auction site bring a trailer, and one of the things I find so interesting is that the value of early SUVs, Blazers and Broncos, which will be $100,000 vehicles easily. Now, because this is advrider.com, is there going to be an equivalency with sort of the motorcycles that most resemble a Bronco, so an R80 GS or some of the is that going to influence, do you think? Is there a parallel?
A bit. I mean, the first couple of years of an R80 GS, that's a $30,000 motorcycle now. You can't find a really good one for much less than that. So yeah, it's happening. Honda Scramblers, let's say early first 62 to 64 CL models. Yeah, they're a really good one, maybe 12, 15 grand, but they made a lot. So you're going to find a lot out there for $4,000 to $8,000 too. So the car thing is different. I mean, car people just have more money, motorcyclists are generally rarely willing to spend a lot of money on what they're interested in. A few people will. For example, bring a trailer. There was a Velocet 500 kind of a Venom that was incorrect. It was very shiny, looked cool, sold for $27,000. And I've been watching Velocet prices tank in the last couple of years, and you can find a really exceptional one for $8,000 to $10,000 of the same model. But who knows why? I mean, bring a trailer is extraordinary in that sense. But to get back to your question, I think that obviously there's a lot of interest. I mean, in the adventure motorcycle segment of motorcycling, I think is the most vital segment of the industry at this point. And that's why, BMW and Harley Davidson introduced the Pan America and Honda reintroduced their bike. Sorry, I'm forgetting the name right now.
Africa Twin.
Africa Twin. And, Triumph makes their Scrambler, and, they're really, really popular. So in that sense, it's deeply influencing the new vehicle market, and a bit the vintage market too. I mean, there's a really strong interest in vintage Scramblers and Enduros for sure.
How do you feel about retro bikes? Often I feel sort of conflicted by them because you're trying to emulate a very specific motorcycle, and if you don't emulate it exactly, then it's kind of wrong.
Right.
I think of the first retro Triumphs from the modern Triumph company,
Yeah.
um, which looks sort of these bloated sort of
Yeah.
heavy bikes. Now, and then the second generation, they seem to get everything right, where they're very, they really have the feel of the original, and how they did a 1200cc engine, that doesn't look that big. I
Right.
mean, it's a very clever design and engineering. How do you feel about that whole scene?
Well, I mean, it's hugely popular for a reason. I mean, I think Triumph's Bonneville and Ducati's Monster and maybe BMW introduced what's the R18? God, my head is today. The new bike. I mean, they're all like these retro
R9T, yes.
R9T. No. Even but the newer one, the bigger flat twin.
Oh, the right, yeah.
These are their best-selling models, and I actually think it's because most contemporary motorcycles are butt ugly. And I have friends who work in the industry as motorcycle designers, and I give them stick about this all the time. It's like the castings are ugly, the frames are ugly, they're just not nice. And that started in the 80s when they started covering bikes with plastic. They no longer needed to make attractive castings. Motors could be as ugly as you wanted underneath all that plastic. And it seems like nobody kind of relearned when bikes went naked again how to make them pretty. And plus, bikes have gotten so enormous and so god awful heavy. I mean, I think a modern Triumph Bonneville is a very good looking bike. It's also 800 pounds. My 65 Bonneville is 430 pounds. And in my opinion, and it has the same amount of power, same top speed basically. And I'd rather ride my vintage one around because it's lighter, it's more agile, it's prettier. But I get why people want something you can start on the button and that's going to run forever. I get it. Modern bikes are amazing. So I don't have a problem with retro bikes if they're done well.
I think the explosion of the physical size and the weight of motorcycles is really startling. And I guess more power, more speed, you need bigger tires and better brakes and stronger frames, and it just kind of keeps going, doesn't it?
And
because
a 7-liter airbox or a 5-liter airbox and a 7-liter exhaust system. I mean, really, it's regulation that's
right,
led to this for the most part.
Because I was telling you that one of the first bikes I rode in the street was a bike I had with my father, of 1947 Indian. And it was I think a little over 500 pounds.
Yeah, it was considered a behemoth back then.
And they were actually, they were nimble, and old panheads and stuff. They're nimble bikes. It's really surprising. And I was on a new Harley recently, and I'm 185 pounds, 6 feet. And there were times, moving it around, getting it in and out of the garage. I mean, it is a lot of motorcycle. It's 830 pounds before fuel.
Yeah.
And at some point, it almost breaches the size of what you as a human can handle. And and I think older stuff, and I think this is people who may be less familiar with older motorcycles than we are. I think they're sometimes shocked at how tiny they are.
Yeah.
And how beautifully scaled they are to the human.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've ridden the cross-country Cannonball vintage endurance rally 3 times. And the first time I rode 1933 Velocette race bike, a KTT, which is 400 cc's. It weighs probably 280 pounds and has about 35 horsepower and will do 110 miles an hour. And it was a blast, especially over the Rockies, and the other 2 times I rode Bruff Superiors, which are also, the heavyweights of the 1930s. And they, weighed 430 pounds each and would cruise at 65 miles all day, 2 up. And like, what more do you need? Do I need a 900 or 1100 pound motorcycle? Well, I get it why they're made that way. Like, the heavier the bike, the more actually reliable and solid it is. Like, you can make a 900 pound motorcycle should just last forever because there's just so much metal in there, and you can carry enough oil and blah, 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 and the frame is robust and the forks are robust. And so, I mean, I get it from that standpoint. but I just think they're ugly and way too heavy, in my opinion. And I think that's part of the reason why motorcycle sales are comparatively dead, and why the population of motorcyclists is aging, is because they're just not fun for most people, especially new riders. They're just not fun. They're intimidating.
You're listening to The Lowdown, presented by advrider.com and sponsored by ebaymotors.com. What are you working on now? Because I know you've got your hand in a lot of things, and you've publisher, a writer, you obviously run the Vintagent. You curate a lot of shows. You've done shows at the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
What are you working on these days?
Yeah, it's an interesting moment. I had a contract for 4 years or 5 years with the Peterson Museum as a guest curator to do their motorcycle shows, and that ended a year ago. And the publishing world is bizarre at this point. It's really hard, even with great ideas, to get a publisher to agree to do a book now. And believe me, I've pitched them. Some of which one of which was actually about adventure riding, which I thought, hello, it's a no-brainer. This is the most popular segment of motorcycling today, all over the world. Can we do a book about adventure riding over time? Because my penultimate exhibit at the Peterson was Adventure Overland. And we had a lot of original examples of motorcycles that had gone around the world in the 20s and 30s, and examples of bikes that had done the first bike that went around the world was 1912. It was a Henderson 4-cylinder. So we had a 1912 Henderson in the exhibit. We also had a 1903 California, which is basically a moped. That was the first motorized vehicle to cross the United States. And then we had stuff that JPL loaned us, Mars rovers and stuff. And also 2 Lost in Space chariots from the original series, and then from the more recent movie. And that was a really, really fun exhibit. And I thought, this is book material, because people loved the show, and I just could not get my publisher interested. Right. So, but I'm working on another book right now. And I don't want to say too much, because I'm doing some hardcore research right now, but it's relevant. It includes movie stars and race relations, and how a couple of silver spooners stole a black man's life story to make a very popular movie, and I never gave him credit. I'll just leave it at that. And if you read my work, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I've been working on this since 2009.
Oh, wow.
And we've had some recent developments, and so things are progressing.
Paul, I mentioned earlier about this notion that older enthusiasts will often, accuse young enthusiasts of being hipsters, which I think is really, unfortunately, dismissive, because they were the same hipster 35 years ago. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, for sure. I saw a meme on Instagram the other day, which I thought was perfect. It was an old man with a cane and a young kid with a backwards baseball cap. And the kid is laughing at the man with the cane who's shaking his cane, but they rotate, and the old man with a cane becomes the young man, and the kid becomes the old man. And it's just like this endless cycle. It's just what it is. It's old man syndrome. But, for my book, Ton Up, which was the last book I did for Motor Books, only available new and signed from the Vintagent.com. I researched the origins of the term cafe racer, and before that, before World War II, the same people were called promenade Percies. And there are all these letters to motorcycle magazines in 1930 of upstanding motorcycle riders, really casting aspersions at younger riders on flashy and noisy bikes, riding up and down the seafronts, trying to pick up girls, and it's like, oh my God, nothing changes.
It's all
nothing
the same.
Changes.
Nothing. Well, it's there was a point I was going to make to that. Yeah, I mean, what amazes me is that you think back to like when the booze fighters were in Hollister and wow, made the cover of Life magazine in what was it, 48 or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. No, of course that was parents were terrified. But then over time, I mean, this happens with Elvis. Elvis was terrifying when he came out. And then all of a sudden your aunt likes Elvis.
Right.
So everything gets softened over time. And I think, and motorcyclists go nuts, and I know I'm going to get hung for saying this, but those kids on modern bikes that take over highways and stunt, I kind of love it because
So
they're just flipping the bird to society, which is the point. Because I saw before you jump in, but I saw there was someone they did this in Toronto recently, a year or so ago, and there was a woman who's in the motorcycle industry, and she was very serious and said, well, why don't they go to a racetrack? Well, no, the point is they want to fuck you up. I mean, that's the point.
That's exactly right. And we have them in San Francisco. The thing I don't like is sometimes they steal those bikes, but in general, I find it thrilling. I mean, I think exactly that. These are those guys from whatever era you're talking about that pissed everybody off. Their bikes were too loud. They were too flashy. They had the wrong haircut. They wore the wrong clothes. They listened to the wrong music. Well, these kids are riding dirt bikes and quads down the streets of San Francisco in packs of 50 or 100, doing wheelies all the time. It's very, very rare that there are any incidents, either of violence or accidents. I mean, it just doesn't happen. They're just out there flipping the bird, metaphorically or literally. And, I think it's the most, it's the same with the Bosozoku in Japan. Nowadays, everybody's like, oh, Bosozoku, that's so cool. Look at these incredible bikes. Well, when they started out, they were basically like the training grounds for the Yakuza, which were the Japanese gangsters, that they were like the feeder team. If you made it as a Bosozoku, you might become a full-fledged yak, and get your tattoos and do the whole thing, but now it's cute and charming, to your point, as things age. And those kids, yeah, they're there to piss you off. I say the same thing. I have some dear friends whose daughter decided that she was actually better suited as a man. And I was talking to her parents, and they said, we don't have any problem with this. It seems normal. It's like, yeah, it completely makes sense given who he is. But the pronouns, it's the pronouns that are killing us. And I said, you know what? It's not clothes. It's not music. It's not dancing. Now they're fucking you up with pronouns because that's all that's left. It's like nobody cares about your hair, your clothes, or your music, but your pronouns, they. Oh my God, that's bad English. I love it.
There's always got to be something to get under our skin, and yeah, I mean, I just love the exuberance, and I sometimes think it's unfortunate that yes, it's irritating when you're stuck in traffic and they stop, but I think it captures a spirit of motorcycling that I think is kind of lost, and so much of the culture of motorcycling gets regurgitated through corporations that are trying to sell us products.
Yeah.
And the beauty of the I don't even know what you'd call them, street riders like this, the beauty of them is that they're
12
doing
o'clock boys.
12 o'clock boys, exactly, and it is that they're doing it outside of they're not being sanctioned.
Yeah, exactly. And just like the Wild One, it was unsanctioned. The term outlaw came from people who were racing bikes outside of the AMA sanction. It started out, first with black riders. They were the first, in the teens and the 20s when black riders wanted to race. They were not allowed to race in the velodromes or the dirt tracks, and I could go further and talk about Harley Davidson's history with race and how they wouldn't, the dealers wouldn't sell to black riders and stuff, and they had to have a whole separate subsystem of buying new bikes in the in the older days. And so the first outlaws were black riders and black racers, and then it became let's say guys who had customized tuned up their Harley Davidson JDHs, which were faster than the Knucklehead, which came out in 36. So you had before the Knucklehead came out, you had 8 years of people tuning these twin cam Harley Davidson JDHs for speed and lightness. That's where the cut down came from. So you had these very light, very fast, 100-mile-an-hour plus bikes. And suddenly Harley Davidson introduced their own overhead valve motorcycle, the Knucklehead, in 1936. And it weighs 200 pounds more. And it's slower than a stock Knucklehead is slower than a stock JDH from 1928. So they didn't want, and they, of course, they were racing the Knucklehead in unlimited class racing, and they didn't want to get beat by their old models. So they banned them. They had the AMA ban them. So people who were racing JDHs were outlaws. And that was the start of a more visible form of outlaw racing and unsanctioned motorcyclists, and kind of the outlaw mentality sort of evolved into clubs, etc., who were doing their own events and racing. And that's kind of what the Wild One is about. It's like you got these guys who are like, we want to do our own thing, so we're just going to steal the trophy from your boring ass AMA event at Hollister and have some fun. So anyway, so these kids they're the new outlaws. It ain't the Hells Angels anymore. Just goofy looking guys in shorts and pulled up socks and backwards baseball caps riding Evos, if they ride at all. And these kids are the real deal. I mean, they're just doing what they want to do. And it will always be thus, whether it's drag racing on the streets with highly tuned mopeds, as you see in Asia, and some on the streets of, let's say, New York and stuff. That's their version of outlaw culture that's happening right now. Or let's say in Indonesia or in Bali, you get people modifying Vespas into 38-wheel living platforms. It's like,
Yeah.
and it's totally illegal. That's outlaw culture. So yeah, outlaw culture is anything the squares think is uncool.
Well, the popular, media certainly in America, I mean, reading Cycle World, you never would have learned about the Latinas in Chicago who ride Hayabusas or Los Angeles. I mean, there's a whole world of motorcycling and of subculture upon subculture upon subculture that the mainstream just doesn't even want to touch, does it?
Yeah.
I guess, but it's always like that. I guess it's always been like that, hasn't it?
There are always subcultures. I love it. And when people ask me what I write about, I said, I write about subcultures mostly. That's really what most interests me is it's what people choose to do that's outside of the mainstream. And I'm much more interested in, it's like the history of motorcycling is generally written, like all these books, 90% of those are corporate history, right? They're talking about what model was introduced when and what designer did what. And that's interesting to me. Not very interesting to most people. It's very interesting to me. And then you've got like a stack, right? Oh, other way, I'm backwards. This stack there is all books about Bosozoku culture.
Right.
I've got a great connection in Japan, and I've got other books, like there's a lot of fiction books back there about motorcycling and books about travel that are non-corporate stories. That these are stories of what people do with motorcycles that I find far more interesting. I have the corporate history because it's really important to know that for me, but I love the history of adventure riding, round the world riding, crazy subcultures. Like my book Ton Up is a whole exploration of the subcultures of cafe racers. I would love to do the same thing with adventure bikes and what that thread is all about, because I think there are really strong subcultures that corporations have picked up on later, always after people started these things. Cut downs and choppers were invented by people decades before, Willie G put a Sportster front end on a twin, or Triumph built their Scrambler, or Honda built their Scrambler. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like the Desert Sled was developed and modified from the 30s to race in Big Bear Scrambles or things like events like that. And the factories kind of caught on and then started to cater to these markets. It's always people leading the industry, because I don't think designers are clever enough to invent a trend.
Is it not the? I'm certainly no fashionista, but is it not the same with fashion that certain kinds of street fashion will then be adopted by corporations? I mean, it's kind of beautiful to me that most of this stuff, which is of course dismissed, ultimately becomes what the corporations make.
Copy, right? Yeah, it's
Copy.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Well, here's a question.
History of motorcycling is the history of people, because I think
Yes.
people have led the industry for a long time. Sorry to interrupt.
One of the things that I find most interesting is that, and we talked about chopper culture in this conversation. We talked about Born Free. It's interesting to me that as the traditional motorcycle shows have died,
Yeah, right.
That all of a sudden these sort of, kind of a field meet has sort of sprung up in their place. And I saw a photograph, and you have seen photographs like this too, where you'll see some guys at the side of the road. They'll be, knucklehead and panhead choppers, and they're dressed. And I think it's a period photograph.
Right.
And then in the background, I'll see a Prius.
Right. Well, there's an element of cosplay.
Absolutely.
Any next gen sort of, the slim tire chopper revival started in about, I'd say maybe 2006, 7, 8, 9. Like Jason Jesse was one of the first people. His bike, the Black Tibetan, really kind of, and this work that Shinya Kimura was doing with Zero and stuff, all in that early to mid 2000s, really led to what you see as the Born Free thing now, which was like a revival of an idea of a chopper as a light, lithe animal that had performance, right? And so the whole chopper revival thing, I get it. I mean, I think those bikes are gorgeous.
They are gorgeous.
A really well done 50s style skinny tire chopper with kicked up exhaust and everything, and maybe a solo seat. It's like, I want one. You look at one, it's like, I want that.
I want that. My spine has other feelings about it, but I want it. But is it, Paul? Is it these revivals? Is it not indicative of a sort of a lack of imagination that we're going backwards, or is it like the White Stripes when the white, rock and roll was getting kind of tepid, then all of a sudden, Jack and Meg show up? I mean, is that what they're doing? Is that the equivalent?
Well, it's complicated. I mean, there's a whole discussion about how men's fashion has not changed at all in the last 50 years. Everything that's coming up is like a revival of something that went before. And maybe there's nothing to change, maybe it's all been said and done. And that's another question about motorcycle design and literature and music. It's like, well, in fact, it isn't the last. There is always something else to say and do. And in fact, but revival culture is a culture. And I actually was a columnist for Men's File magazine for years out of England. Now it's out of Japan. And it's all about revivalism. And the founder of the magazine, Nick Clements, did his doctoral thesis on revival subcultures. And it's a fascinating subject. And it's a whole other thing, The downside is a lack of imagination. And even, I was part of the group that started the Wheels and Waves Festival in France. It was kind of my divorce party in 2009. A dozen of us went for a ride in the Pyrenees, from Biarritz, and it just kind of grew and grew. And, the heritage workwear thing, the ampersand culture, let's call it, right. is like heavy in that scene, and people dress a certain way and they like a certain bikes, and and I'm kind of a fuck you guy, and I show up in some weird Issey Miyake pleated jumpsuit in the morning to go look at people's bikes, and they're treating me like, if they don't know me, they're like, what kind of freak is this? You don't fit in here. I'm like, that's the point, guys. I don't want to fit in anywhere. I just want to be me, and you can wear your clothes that you bought from the stall over there because they're perfect reproductions of a 1950s, Levi's 503 or whatever, but revival culture gets resold back to people. It becomes a commercialization, it becomes an opportunity for capitalism, as we talked about. It's like, just like with the motorcycles, people lead the culture and then people figure out how to cash in on it. And revival culture is a little bit of that. I mean, because people start wearing it and then see people start producing it, and then it becomes a commercial opportunity. And, it's like, anyway, it's a very complicated subject. I would not claim to have the last word on revival mentality. There was a time when I would cosplay on 1920s bikes wearing 1920s gear until a friend of mine who was wearing a DeVita pudding basin, a new DeVita pudding basin helmet on his 1925 Sunbeam, had a tire blowout and hit his head and died. And I realized, hey man, we're playing with the rent money here. This is the real deal. And so I stopped wearing those helmets. I stopped being photographed with those helmets because they're not safe. And I think you're an idiot if you don't ride with a helmet, or a good helmet at least. And because I've lost way too many friends from traumatic brain injury. And so that ended my cosplay period. I realized, you know what, this is dumb. I'm just going to wear what I'm going to wear. And but I don't have a problem with people dressing with perfect period 1950s, 60s 1%er gang clothing, because they look great. They look hot. It's great fashion. I don't have a problem with that.
I say we wrap things up today with a word from our sponsor. eBay Motors is here for the ride. With some elbow grease, fresh installs, and a whole lot of love, you transformed 100,000 miles and a body full of rust into a drive that's all your own. Brake kits, LED headlights, whatever you need, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber and not cash. Keep your ride alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Thank you for listening to The Lowdown Show.